The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was a pivotal conflict in United States history. It was primarily caused by the long-standing debate over slavery, states' rights, and the growing divide between the North and South. In the early 19th century, the United States was divided into two distinct regions. The North was more industrialized, with a focus on manufacturing and a growing abolitionist movement. Meanwhile, the South was largely agricultural, dependent on slave labor to maintain its economy, particularly in the cotton industry. The issue of slavery had been brewing for decades, but it reached a boiling point in the 1850s. The North and South had opposing views on the morality and future of slavery. The South, where slavery was entrenched, wanted to maintain it, while the North sought to abolish it. The 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln, an anti-slavery Republican, was the final straw for many Southern states. They feared that his presidency would lead to the abolition of slavery, which would devastate their economy. In response, Southern states began to secede from the Union, starting with South Carolina in December 1860. By the time Lincoln took office in March 1861, 7 Southern states had seceded. The first major conflict of the Civil War took place at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861. When Union forces refused to surrender the fort to Confederate forces, Confederate artillery opened fire. This marked the beginning of the Civil War. Following the attack on Fort Sumter, both sides quickly mobilized for war. The Union, also known as the North, was led by President Abraham Lincoln. The Confederacy, formed by the seceded Southern states, was led by President Jefferson Davis. In the early months of the war, the Confederacy enjoyed a series of victories. General Robert E. Lee, one of the most respected military leaders at the time, took command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. His strategy was to invade the North and force a quick resolution to the conflict. In battles like the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861, the Confederates defeated the Union forces and sent shockwaves through the North. Despite these early setbacks, the Union was determined to preserve the nation. Lincoln recognized that this war was not only about preserving the Union, but also about ending slavery. As the conflict dragged on, he began to issue measures that would weaken the Confederate states, including the famous Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which declared the freedom of slaves in Confederate-held territories. By 1863, the war had turned into a brutal and prolonged struggle. The Union began to gain ground with significant victories in key battles. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to 3rd, 1863, was a major turning point. It marked the first significant defeat of General Robert E. Lee's army, and the Union's victory halted the Confederate advance into Northern territory. The Battle of Gettysburg was followed by the Union's capture of the Mississippi River at the Battle of Vicksburg. This gave the Union control over the entire river, cutting the Confederacy in half and crippling their ability to move troops and supplies. In the West, General Ulysses S. Grant rose to prominence, leading the Union Army to victories in battles such as Shiloh and Vicksburg. His aggressive tactics and determination earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. By 1864, Grant was promoted to General-in-Chief of the Union Army, where he would oversee the final stages of the war. Meanwhile, the Confederacy struggled with mounting losses, a lack of resources, and a growing sense of hopelessness. While Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was still formidable, the South lacked the manpower and industrial resources to sustain a prolonged conflict. The Union's victory seemed inevitable as the war dragged into 1864 and 1865. In March 1864, General Grant implemented a strategy of total war, which involved targeting not only Confederate armies, but also the South's economic resources. This strategy, combined with the relentless pressure from Union forces on all fronts, eventually wore down the Confederate resistance. In 1864, President Lincoln was re-elected, which gave the Union additional political stability and morale. However, the South continued to fight fiercely despite dwindling resources. By April 1865, General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was surrounded by Union forces near Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Lee, realizing that further resistance was futile, surrendered to General Grant on April 9, 1865. The surrender marked the end of the Civil War, but the human cost was staggering. Approximately 620,000 Americans died during the conflict, making it the deadliest war in U.S. history. The war had abolished slavery, but it left the South in ruins, and the task of rebuilding the nation, known as Reconstruction, would prove to be a long and difficult process. Abraham Lincoln, who had led the nation through the war, was tragically assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 14, 1865, just days after the surrender at Appomattox. His death cast a shadow over the victory, but his legacy as the president who preserved the Union and ended slavery would endure. The Civil War had fundamentally changed the United States. It had preserved the Union, ended slavery, and set the stage for a new era of civil rights struggles which would continue for decades.